Roy Bennett had lived on his family farm in Ashford for 43 years, the land passed down from his father, who had passed it down from his grandfather. Roy worked the soil alone now, his wife gone and his children grown and living in the city. He woke before dawn each day, fed the few chickens, checked the fence line, and walked the fields with a quiet sense of duty. The farm was not rich, but it was his, and that meant everything. One dry summer he decided to dig a new well near the eastern edge of his property, because the old one had started to give less water. Roy knew he could not afford to hire anyone, so he took his shovel and pick and began to work under the burning sun. The ground was hard and rocky, and he dug slowly, a foot at a time. On the third day, when he was about 6 feet deep, his shovel struck something metal. The sound was dull but solid, not like stone. Roy stopped, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and knelt down in the hole. His fingers brushed away dirt and revealed a rusted metal box, about the size of a small suitcase. The lock was broken and the lid had been crushed by the weight of the earth. He pried it open with the tip of his shovel, the hinges groaned, and then he saw what was inside: a revolver, old but clean, 3 spent bullet casings, and a single photograph. The photograph showed a man holding a child. The man had kind eyes and a beard. The child was a girl of maybe 8 or 9, both of them smiling in front of a wooden barn. On the back of the photograph someone had written a date in faded blue ink. Roy recognized the date immediately because it was the same day that Peter Hollis had vanished from Ashford 20 years ago. Everyone in town remembered that disappearance. Peter had been a quiet farmer who lived just 2 miles down the road. He had gone out one evening to check his livestock and never come back. His horse returned without him, and the sheriff searched for weeks but found nothing: no body, no blood, no clue. The case grew cold and people stopped talking about it, but Roy had never forgotten. Now he was holding a revolver in spent casings and a photograph of Peter with his daughter Martha. Roy's hands began to shake. He looked around the field. The sun was setting and the shadows were long. He was alone. He thought about calling the sheriff, but something held him back, a cold feeling in his stomach. He put everything back into the box, closed the lid, and covered the hole with dirt, telling himself he would think about it tomorrow. That night Roy did not sleep well. He lay in his old bed and listened to the wind outside, and every time the house creaked he thought of Peter Hollis. The next morning he went back to the field. The dirt he had thrown over the box was undisturbed, but he did not dig it up again. Instead he marked the spot with a small stone and went back to his chores. That afternoon a dark truck came up the gravel road to his farm. Roy did not recognize the truck or the man behind the wheel. The man stepped out. He was tall and clean-shaven, wearing a khaki jacket and boots that had never seen mud. He walked toward Roy with a smile that did not reach his eyes, introduced himself as Calvin Rhodes, and said he was a land buyer from the next county. He had heard that Roy might be willing to sell a portion of his property, specifically the eastern field. Roy felt a chill run down his spine, because the eastern field was exactly where he had found the box. He said no, he was not selling any land. Calvin Rhodes insisted, offering 3 times what the land was worth, his voice smooth and patient like a man who was used to getting what he wanted. Roy said no again, and Calvin's smile faded. He looked at Roy for a long moment, then nodded and got back into his truck. As he drove away, Roy noticed the truck had no license plates. That night Roy checked the locks on his doors for the first time in 20 years. He also checked on his chickens and his barn. Everything seemed normal. He went to bed but left a lamp burning in the kitchen. He woke to the smell of smoke just after 2 in the morning, ran outside in his boots and saw the old hay barn at the far end of the eastern field on fire. Flames climbed into the dark sky and the heat hit his face like a wall. He had no phone and no way to call for help. His nearest neighbor was a mile away. He grabbed a bucket and threw water, but it was useless. The barn burned to the ground in less than an hour. Roy stood there watching, his arms sore and his heart pounding. He knew this was no accident. Someone had set the fire, someone who wanted him to leave, someone who knew about the box. Roy Bennett was not a man who scared easily, but as the ashes glowed red in the darkness, he understood that he had stepped into something much bigger than a forgotten crime. The next morning he took his shovel and walked back to the eastern field, dug up the metal box again, and this time opened it under the gray light of dawn. He looked at the revolver more carefully. It was a Smith & Wesson Model 10, a common gun, but he noticed a small engraving on the grip, the letters P and H, the initials of Peter Hollis. He then examined the spent casings. They were of the same caliber as the revolver, and there were 3 of them, 3 bullets fired. He turned the photograph over again and looked at the date, August 17, 2006, that was the day Peter Hollis disappeared. Roy realized that the revolver had probably been used to kill someone, but who, and where was the body? He also realized that the land Calvin Rhodes wanted to buy was the same land where the box had been buried and where the barn had just burned, so Calvin Rhodes knew something. Roy decided he would not go to the sheriff yet, not until he had more answers. He carefully put the box into a canvas bag and walked back to his house, hiding the bag under the floorboards of his bedroom. Then he sat at his kitchen table and thought about Peter Hollis and his daughter Martha, who had been 9 years old when her father vanished. After the disappearance, she had been sent to live with an aunt in another state, and no one in Ashford had heard from her since. Roy wondered where she was now and whether she knew anything about the revolver and the spent casings. He decided to start asking questions, quietly, without drawing attention. He remembered old man Tom Wheeler, who lived at the edge of town and had been a friend of Peter's. Tom was still alive, though he was nearly 90, and his mind wandered. Roy put on his jacket and walked to Tom's house. The road was empty and the sky was overcast. He felt the weight of the secret in his chest with every step. This was only the beginning, and he already knew that finding the truth would cost him more than he was ready to pay. Tom Wheeler lived in a small white house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Roy knocked on the door and waited. The old man took a long time to answer. When he finally came to the door, he squinted at Roy as if trying to remember a face from a dream. Roy asked about Peter Hollis, and Tom's expression changed. His eyes grew sharp and clear for a moment. He said Peter was a good man, a hard worker, but he had a temper. One time Peter caught a neighbor's dog chasing his sheep and he broke the dog's leg with a shovel. Roy listened and filed the detail away, then asked about Martha. Tom said the girl was quiet, always watching. She had her father's eyes but not his temper. She was clever, too clever for a child. Tom said that after Peter disappeared, Martha never cried in public, not once, and that had struck him as strange. Roy asked if Tom remembered anything unusual on the day Peter vanished. Tom scratched his chin and thought for a long time, then said yes. He remembered that Peter had argued with someone in the afternoon, a man in a black truck. Tom did not recognize the man or the truck, but he remembered the argument because Peter had shouted loud enough to be heard from the road. Roy felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. A black truck 20 years ago, and now Calvin Rhodes had arrived in a dark truck with no plates. He thanked Tom and left, walking back toward his farm with his mind racing. He thought about the revolver and the 3 spent casings, 3 bullets fired but only one person missing, Peter Hollis, unless Peter had not been the only victim. Roy decided to search the eastern field more carefully, not just the spot where he had found the box but the entire area around the old well site. He waited until nightfall, took a lantern and a shovel, and walked to the field under a half moon. The burned barn was still smoking faintly, the smell of charred wood hung in the air. Roy began to dig test holes near the base of the old well, which had been dry for decades, its stone walls crumbling. He dug a foot down, then 2 feet, nothing but dirt and rocks, so he moved 10 feet to the left and dug again. On his 3rd hole, about 3 feet deep, his shovel hit something soft. He stopped and knelt down. His fingers brushed away dirt and uncovered a piece of old leather. He pulled it free and saw it was a belt, not a farmer's belt but a fancy one with a silver buckle. He wiped the dirt off the buckle and saw an inscription, the initials C&R, Calvin Rhodes. Roy's heart nearly stopped. He stared at the belt for a full minute, then put it in his pocket and covered the hole. He hurried back to his house, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table with the belt in front of him. Calvin Rhodes had been in Ashford 20 years ago. He had argued with Peter Hollis, and now he was back trying to buy the land where the belt had been buried. The pieces were starting to fit together, but Roy still did not know what had happened to Peter or where Martha was. He decided to look for Martha. The next morning he drove his old pickup truck to the county records office in the nearest town, a small dusty place run by a middle-aged woman who did not ask questions. Roy searched the files and found Martha Hollis's birth certificate. Her mother had died when she was 3, and her only living relative was an aunt named Eleanor Crane who lived in a town called Benton, 3 hours away. Roy wrote down the address and left. He did not have a phone so he could not call ahead. He simply got in his truck and drove. The road was long and straight, and he had time to think, wondering why Calvin Rhodes wanted the land so badly. Maybe the body of Peter Hollis was buried somewhere on that field. Maybe Calvin had killed Peter and buried him there. But then why would Calvin come back after 20 years, unless he had heard that Roy was digging a well and was afraid the body would be found? Roy pressed the accelerator and the truck rumbled forward. Benton was a small town smaller than Ashford. He found Eleanor Crane's house easily, a yellow cottage with a garden full of sunflowers. He knocked on the door. A woman in her 60s answered. She had gray hair and tired eyes. Roy introduced himself and said he was looking for Martha. Eleanor's face went blank. She said Martha had left Benton 10 years ago and no one knew where she went. She had taken her things and disappeared just like her father. Eleanor said Martha had always been a difficult girl, secretive. She never spoke about what happened in Ashford and never asked about her father. It was as if Peter Hollis had never existed. Roy asked if Martha had ever mentioned a man named Calvin Rhodes. Eleanor shook her head and said no, but then she paused and added that before Martha left she had received a letter with no return address, and after that letter Martha had packed a bag and left the same night. Roy thanked Eleanor and drove back to Ashford. The sun was setting and he felt a deep weariness in his bones. He had more questions than answers. That night he could not sleep. He lay in bed and thought about the photograph of the smiling man holding his daughter, 3 spent casings, a belt with the initials C&R, and a fire that had destroyed his barn. He knew Calvin Rhodes would come back, and next time he might not just burn a barn. Roy got up and took the metal box from under the floorboards, opened it and looked at the revolver again. It was still loaded. He checked the cylinder. It had 3 empty chambers and 3 live rounds. The same 3 that had been fired, the same 3 that had killed someone. He put the revolver back and hid the box again, then sat in the dark and waited for the dawn. He did not know that Calvin Rhodes was already watching his house from the tree line, and that Martha Hollis was already on her way back to Ashford, driving a rented car under a false name. Both of them drawn to the same piece of land, both willing to do whatever it took to keep the past buried. Roy Bennett had found the well, but he had also found the devil, and the devil was coming home. Roy woke at sunrise to the sound of a car engine, not the rumble of Calvin's truck but a smaller sound, a sedan. He looked out the window and saw a woman stepping out of a gray car. She was in her late 20s with dark hair pulled back and a face that looked familiar. Roy recognized her from the photograph. She was Martha Hollis, grown but still bearing the same sharp eyes and the same quiet stillness he had seen in the picture. She walked toward his door without hesitation, and Roy opened it before she could knock. She looked at him for a moment, then spoke, but Roy did not answer. He simply stepped aside and let her in, remembering he was not supposed to include dialogue, so he would describe actions. Martha entered the kitchen, looked around at the modest furniture and the old stove, then sat down at the table, and Roy sat across from her. She pulled something from her jacket pocket, a folded piece of paper, and slid it across the table. Roy unfolded it and saw a hand-drawn map of his farm with the eastern field marked with an X, the exact spot of the box. He looked up at Martha. Her expression was cold and unreadable. She pointed at the map, then at the floor, as if asking where the box was. Roy shook his head, stood up and walked to the bedroom, pulled the metal box from under the floorboards and brought it to the kitchen, setting it on the table and opening it. Martha looked at the revolver, the spent casings, and the photograph. Her eyes did not change. She picked up the photograph and stared at it for a long time, then put it back and looked at Roy, reaching into her jacket again to pull out a second photograph. This one was newer. It showed a man with a bloody forehead lying on the ground. The man was Peter Hollis. Roy's breath caught in his throat. He pointed at the photograph, then at Martha, asking without words if she had been the one. Martha did not deny it. She simply nodded once, slowly, then took a third photograph from her pocket. This one showed a young Calvin Rhodes standing next to Martha, both of them looking at the camera with dead eyes. Roy understood now. Calvin Rhodes had not killed Peter. Martha had killed her own father, and Calvin had helped her bury the body and hide the evidence. The 3 spent casings were from the revolver she had used, and the belt she had dropped while digging the grave. Calvin had come back to buy the land because he had heard Roy was digging a new well and was afraid the bones would be found, and now Martha was here too, so Roy had both of them in his orbit. He looked at Martha and saw no remorse in her face, only calculation. She pointed at the metal box and then at the door, indicating that she wanted to take it away. Roy shook his head again. He knew that if he gave her the box she would disappear and no one would ever know the truth, but he also knew that if he kept the box he would be in danger. He had already lost his barn and did not want to lose his life, so he decided to stall. He stood up and walked to the stove as if to make coffee, but instead grabbed a cast iron skillet and hid it behind his back. Martha was watching him. She was smarter than he had expected. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a knife, a small kitchen knife but sharp, and stood up, taking a step toward him. Roy swung the skillet and struck her arm. The knife clattered to the floor. Martha screamed a short angry sound but did not retreat. She came at him with her other hand clawing at his face. Roy was stronger and heavier. He pushed her back against the wall and held her there until she stopped struggling. He did not want to hurt her more than necessary, but he could not let her go. He looked for something to tie her hands and found an old rope in the pantry, bound her wrists and ankles, and left her sitting on the floor. Then he took the metal box and the 3 photographs and walked out the door, heading to the sheriff's office. It was 3 miles to town, and he had no car because Martha's car was there, but he did not want to leave her alone, so he walked fast, the box heavy under his arm. He had gone less than half a mile when he saw the dark truck coming up the road, Calvin Rhodes. Calvin saw Roy and stopped the truck, got out, his face pale and his jaw tight. He did not speak, simply walked toward Roy with his hands open as if asking for the box. Roy stood his ground, holding the box against his chest and staring at Calvin, who took one more step. Then Roy saw the glint of a pistol in Calvin's hand, a small revolver similar to the one in the box. Calvin raised it and pointed at Roy's chest. Roy did not flinch. He had lived a long life and had faced many hard things. A gun did not frighten him as much as the betrayal hidden in that metal box. Calvin pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The gun clicked empty. Calvin looked at it in confusion, and in that moment Roy lunged forward and struck Calvin's wrist with the corner of the box. The empty gun fell to the dirt. Calvin stumbled back. Roy swung the box again and hit Calvin in the side of the head. Calvin fell to his knees and then onto his face, unconscious. Roy stood there breathing hard, then picked up the empty gun and put it in his pocket, continuing to walk toward town, leaving Calvin in the road. When Roy reached the sheriff's office, he was tired and bleeding from a cut on his forehead that he had not noticed. He placed the metal box on the desk and explained everything without once quoting a word. The sheriff listened, his face growing pale, and deputies were sent to Roy's farm. where they found Martha still tied up on the kitchen floor and Calvin still unconscious on the dirt road. Later that week, the sheriff and his men dug up the eastern field. They found human bones at the bottom of the old well, hidden under a layer of stones and packed earth. Dental records confirmed that the bones belonged to Peter Hollis. The revolver from the box matched the 3 spent casings, and the bullet wounds on the bones matched the caliber. Martha Hollis confessed to killing her father after a violent argument when she was 9 years old, and Calvin Rhodes, who was her mother's cousin, had helped her hide the body and had kept her secret for 2 decades. Calvin had returned to Ashford because he heard Roy Bennett had started digging, and he had tried to buy the land and burn the barn to scare Roy away, but it had not worked. Roy Bennett had refused to be scared, and because of that a 20-year-old crime was finally solved. Martha and Calvin were arrested and taken to the county jail, awaiting trial. Roy returned to his farm. The eastern field was fenced off and the well was filled in. He looked at the empty space where his barn had stood and felt a strange kind of peace. He had lost a barn but gained the truth, and for a man like Roy Bennett that was more than enough. He walked back to his house, sat on his porch, and watched the sun set over the fields of Ashford. The land was still his and the dead could finally rest. The story of Peter Hollis became a quiet legend in the town, told in whispers, but Roy never spoke of it again. He simply lived his life day after day until the winter took him many years later. A farmer who had dug a well and found a grave and who had refused to look away, that was his legacy, and that was the end.